What is the Donkey Kong universe? What are we referring to when we discuss this shared universe of video games that seems to defy corporate boundaries, while seemingly ignoring the more mainstream sentiment that the Donkey Kong series merely exists on the larger map of the Super Mario franchise? Why is our focus on Donkey Kong Country, and after that Banjo-Kazooie and Conker, and not on, say, the 1981 original arcade game? It's honestly one of the biggest hurdles we at DK Vine have had to jump when trying to build our audience. But that's because our website is old and busted, a product of the 1990s and the fan culture that developed during Rare Limited and Nintendo's historic partnership of that era. And yet, the spirit of the DKU, of a shared universe of anthropomorphic animals, inanimate objects turned googly-eyed deviants, drunken pirates, drunken squirrels, drunken skeletons, and Pavarotti poo that's parallel to, and occasionally intersecting with, the Super Mario universe, has endured for 30 years despite buyouts, complicated rights issues, and the fog of time. First of all, let's clear up a couple of misconceptions. The Donkey Kong universe, despite the name, is really more of the Rare shared universe, a vast, interconnected network of video games from the studio Rare Limited that all take place within the same fictional world, and most of which take place in the same archipelago of islands. We refer to it as the Donkey Kong universe because the game that Rare more or less built their universe on the back of was Donkey Kong Country, the breakout 1994 mega hit that took them from well-regarded electronic entertainment journeymen to the rock stars of the video game world. And let's face it, calling it the Donkey Kong universe just gets more eyeballs. Chances are, you wouldn't be watching this crap if I was dangling Saberman's flat old man ass in front of your face. But Donkey Kong? There's something you can sink your teeth into. And while Ultimate Play the Game, Rare's predecessor studio that they evolved out of, did briefly pay some lip service to the notion that their games existed in the same world, releasing this map of the Land of Ultimatum in Ultimate Play the Game, the collected works, it wasn't until Donkey Kong Country, and more specifically a game that was released 3 years later, Diddy Kong Racing, that the idea really took off. And no, it wasn't Rare's initial plan to build a shared universe out of Diddy Kong Racing. But in this era of AI-generated writing and lack of media literacy, people seem to confuse the creative process with adhering to a master plan without deviation, or straying from that initial plan is tantamount to apocrypha. But once that genie was out of the bottle for Rare games existing in a shared universe, the marketing teams, writers, and certain creative talent at Rare made sure to keep granting our wishes of a consistent, interconnected world of weirdos, to the point that acknowledgement and references continue to this very day across 3 separate companies. In the 19th and most of the 20th century, the concept of a shared universe of fiction was really only celebrated by science fiction fans and comic book readers. But the idea stretches back to antiquity. You could even make the argument that the disparate poems and stories that form the Epic of Gilgamesh constitute the earliest shared universe on record. In the era of the printing press, author Jules Verne played with the concept when Captain Nemo from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Tom Ayrton from In Search of the Castaways both appeared in The Mysterious Island, published in 1875. Universal Studios would also bring their numerous gothic horror properties, most of them literary adaptations in their own right, together in various monster mashes in the 1940s and 1950s, a dark universe that would cross over with the Abbott and Costello franchise. But by and large, this level of fanciful world building was probably a bit much for the basic white bread audiences who were the tastemakers of the mid-20th century. However, occasionally a shared universe would penetrate the mainstream culture, usually for purely convenience's sake. Like when television producers realized you could take one popular show and make it two by spinning off one of its characters. The anthology show Love, American Style, would spawn Happy Days, which in turn would give us Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy, Joni Loves Chachi, Blankski's Beauties, the Fonz and the Happy Days gang, Chris Alcock favorite Laverne and Shirley in the Army, and, naturally, the Mork and Mindy, Laverne and Shirley Fonz Hour, the Avengers Endgame of the day. Happy Days fans and television historians also argue about whether or not the supernatural sitcom Out of the Blue was a Happy Days spinoff due to the pilot episode airing 1 week before an episode of Happy Days that featured a guest appearance by Out of the Blue's lead, an angel from heaven named Random. Random the Angel. Their generation didn't know the damage lead poisoning was doing to them. A 1970s shared universe with a bit more critical prestige was the Norman Lear universe, which started with All in the Family in 1971 and had spin-offs going all the way until 1994, when it was replaced with the Donkey Kong universe. All in the Family would eventually spin off the series Maude, The Jeffersons, sequel series Archie Bunker's Place, Gloria, and 704 Hauser. We even have spin-offs of the spin-offs, with Maude giving us Good Times, and Jefferson's characters trekking to checking in. In the 1980s, ABC's Perfect Strangers would lead to eventual Steve Urkel vehicle Family Matters. NBC's Cheers would branch off The Tortellis, and then far more successfully, Frasier. And then Frasier. But again, truthfully, the organic elevation of a supporting character into their own show, like taking erudite barfly Frasier Crane out of Cheers and focusing on his family in Seattle, or Breaking Bad's spin-off Better Call Saul, which examines the hidden life of criminal lawyer Saul Goodman, exploring his early battles with reputable lawyers and murderous drug cartel enforcers. By the way, I'm going to be dropping some pretty significant Better Call Saul spoilers on you for the next hour or so. Is probably the less used spin-off route, because more often than not they just be spin-offs by way of the backdoor pilot. A sneaky way to get fans of one property invested in another by introducing a totally new character who's actually appearing from a show already in production, but yet to debut. And so it was that Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Quest, announced at E3 1997, were grandfathered, or grandfather who raised their grandson as a son, like a father, into the Donkey Kong universe. As reiterated by project leader Greg Mails, after which people would routinely tag me on social media to tell me to eat shit, Banjo-Kazooie was never actually conceived to be a Donkey Kong spin-off. It was simply what developed out of all of the different iterations of Dream, the project that the bulk of the original Donkey Kong Country team started after completing Donkey Kong Country 2. It was supposed to be given the plumb late November 1997 release date, even backed up by a multi-million-dollar Taco Bell tie-in. This was marketed with great fanfare at E3 1997, but behind the scenes, the team working on Banjo-Kazooie had their doubts that the 3D platformer, despite coming along quickly, would be polished and ready in time. and failing to deliver this for Nintendo would have been disastrous for Rare. Conker's Quest, which would eventually be renamed to 12 Tales Conker 64, was more of a boutique project for Rare, at the time scheduled to be their first self-published game, albeit still exclusive to the Nintendo 64. However, Nintendo was not only publishing Banjo-Kazooie with an ownership stake in the new franchise, but they were putting all of their eggs in its basket to carry that year's holiday season. See, the N64 was struggling in late 1997, probably more than Nintendo expected, and 1 year after its launch, the console didn't have much in the way of killer titles to carry its early momentum. Keep in mind that this was also a year before Pokémon was brought to the West. Rare had brought them great success with the Donkey Kong Country series, Killer Instinct, and, recently, the N64's GoldenEye 007, and they were counting on lightning to strike yet again in November 1997. Of course, it wasn't meant to be. There was too much to be done on Banjo-Kazooie, and not enough time. Rare refused to release a substandard product, and it would ultimately be pushed back well into 1998. But the studio was so prolific in this era that it just so happened that they had another N64 game in the works, just lying around, shown off to Nintendo behind the scenes at E3 1997, but not demoed or even announced at the trade show, that could conceivably be finished and on store shelves by Black Friday. Luckily, Nintendo saw a lot of potential in the title, although they were a bit concerned with its marketability. It was Pro-Am 64, a follow-up of sorts to their RC Pro-Am duology on the Nintendo Entertainment System, although even that branding wasn't hit upon at first. It was originally Wild Cartoon Kingdom, and then Adventure Racers, a racing game devised by Rare's Lee Schuneman that was heavily inspired by Disney theme parks, with its environments segmented into different thematic lands, such as a prehistoric Lost World. By the time of E3 97, much of the game as we know it was in place, although its star was still Timber the Tiger. Pro-Am 64 was also planned to be self-published by Rare, which makes sense given the pre-existing lineage of the series. But Nintendo saw an opportunity. They felt the core fundamentals of the game, a varied mix of racing married to exploration, collecting, and the spirit of adventure, was a winning formula, and while superficially similar to the earlier Mario Kart 64, was still unlike anything else in the Nintendo library. But it needed a marketable hook. It needed a recognizable star to bring in a pre-existing audience. It needed the Kongs. As mentioned, it was 1994's Donkey Kong Country that took Rare from respected industry workhorses into recognized household names. If you had a Nintendo console in the mid to late 1990s, you knew that resplendent golden and blue Rareware logo. But beyond the shine it put on Rare, DKC also renewed and reinvented the popularity of the Donkey Kong brand. While the original arcade game put Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto on the map, it was the stout Italian-American Jumpman who would chart their course for worldwide dominance. The Donkey Kong arcade games gave way to Mario Bros., and after it evolved into the groundbreaking Super Mario Bros., Nintendo never looked back. Mario Mania raged in the latter half of the 1980s, and even well into the early 1990s, but by 1993 seemed to be on the wane. The critical drubbing and lackluster box office of Super Mario Bros. The movie, as well as the 90s appeal of Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog, didn't necessarily hurt the Mario brand, but it definitely pushed it out of the zeitgeist for a bit. While Mario retreated, it finally opened the door for Donkey Kong's spectacular return. 11 years after Donkey Kong 3, the series was reignited in 1994 with Donkey Kong Country. Rare developing the game with Silicon graphics workstations made even the most casual of gamers sit up and take notice, no matter whether they knew the history behind Donkey Kong or not. And while Nintendo did release Donkey Kong for the Game Boy earlier that year to help reacquaint the then modern Nintendo fans with the original concept, it would be Rare who would completely reinvent the DK mythos from the ground up over the next 3 years. For 2 of those years, until the launch of the Nintendo 64 and Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong more or less served as Nintendo's de facto flagship franchise, which permanently cemented what Donkey Kong was for all subsequent generations. Yes, Rare's Donkey Kong acknowledged that the arcade games happened, but it radically rethought the setting, modus operandi, and overall feeling of the series. It's what would become known as a soft reboot, aging up and redesigning the original characters, separating it from its historical ties to Mario or Pauline, giving it a sense of place by establishing Donkey Kong Island, and later Crocodile Isle and the Northern Hemisphere, and introducing new co-stars and supporting cast members. The most successful of those characters was Diddy Kong, the modern Donkey Kong sidekick and aspiring video game hero who took the starring role in Donkey Kong Country 2. So when Nintendo proposed to Rare that they either make Donkey Kong or Diddy Kong the build star of Pro-Am 64 to help increase its marketability, Rare chose their wholly original creation, arguably the most popular character they've ever created. They also probably felt that they had more agency with Diddy Kong, developing his character arc from scratch and making him the lead of a game where Donkey Kong doesn't even make a cameo appearance was the natural culmination of what they had started back in 1994. The game's storyline would then see original game star Timber the Tiger, son of the proprietors of racing resort Timbers Island, endure an alien invasion by the extraterrestrial warlord Wizpig, while his parents were vacationing on Donkey Kong Island. Timber, who was old friends with Diddy due to early childhood holidays with his family, wrote to the video game hero imploring him for aid, a distress call that Diddy would answer. While the individual inhabitants of Timbers Island would still have their own minor stories in Diddy Kong Racing, such as Pipsy the Mouse being exiled from her home in the mountains due to Wizpig making that his base of operations, much of the game's plot was refitted to be seen from the heroic perspective of Diddy. It was, after all, Diddy Kong Racing, and to the average gamer who had no idea of the early impetus behind the game or why it now starred the young monkey, it was effectively part of the Donkey Kong series. And this gave Rare a unique opportunity. Much like the way that network TV would try to rub the success of an established hit program off on a new, untested sitcom, Rare could do the same with the Donkey Kong Country brand and the games they currently had in development. Since Diddy Kong Racing was now releasing before Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Quest, they could introduce the characters of Banjo and Conker, but from the context of Diddy Kong Racing and Donkey Kong Country. Yes, Diddy Kong Racing could be a backdoor pilot to both 3D platforming franchises, the one for Nintendo and the one for themselves, that Rare was attempting to launch. This is also where historical context is vitally important. Due to Diddy Kong Racing having not been commercially available for quite a long period of time, many of these details are just no longer common knowledge. I've seen some younger fans just assume that Banjo and Conker were guest characters in a Donkey Kong series game, no different than a litany of weird IP pulls in fighting games, or how Batman, Mariah Carey, and Emperor Palpatine will show up in Fortnite. But outside of unusual circumstances, like maybe Earthworm Jim and Booger Man guesting in Clay Fighter 63 1/3, this modern notion really wasn't a thing in 1997. And it's not like Banjo and Conker were just there as empty voids, character skins with no explanation. We just expected to clap like trained seals upon seeing a combination of design elements we recognize. Consumers didn't know who Banjo and Conker were yet. This isn't, with all due respect, Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing with Banjo-Kazooie. Unless you regularly read video game magazines or dialed up your modem to check out the latest gaming news online, there wasn't any popularity to trade on here. And so they were introduced with no separation from the rest of the cast, with their own storylines reflecting their status as friends of Diddy Kong. The first time either Banjo or Conker are ever mentioned within a video game is in the Diddy Kong Racing manual story.
He'd been asked to help, so his intention to zip off as soon as possible could not be in doubt. The question that preoccupied him now was whether or not he should draft some extra help just in case. After all, this whiz pig sounded like a pretty mean foe. Finally, he decided that his friends, Banjo and Conker, would still enjoy an adventure, even if it turned out that their services weren't needed. So the young ape dug out a pencil stub from the mess of his bedroom and hopped back into his seat, whistling for squawks. Squawks! His own makeshift carrier pigeon, he began to scribble out a couple of messages of his own.
We'll just politely ignore that Diddy Kong is a monkey, not an ape, and focus in on the accurate information. Banjo and Conker, chums of Diddy, and how this was further elaborated in the character section of the manual.
Even before the start of his future partnership with Kazooie, Banjo isn't one to turn down the chance of an adventure. So when Squawks brings the message from his pal Diddy Kong, the honey bear stuffs a few things into his trusty backpack and takes to his heels.
Another friend made by Diddy Kong on one of his endless adventures of Donkey Kong, Conker is also an exploration nut who will jump at any chance to break free of a squirrel's less than exciting daily routine. He's eager to join up with Banjo as the bear passes through.
Banjo and Conker weren't just interlopers. They were acquaintances of Diddy who answered when Kongdor called for aid. Squawks even flew to Banjo's house to deliver Diddy's letter, and thus it's firmly established that they lived within the same archipelago of islands laid out by the Donkey Kong Country games. An archipelago that now included Timbers Island, Spiral Mountain, and Conker's home, established in his eventual first game as Willow Woods. This was a masterstroke on Rare's end. Not only did they make the best out of a bad situation with Banjo-Kazooie's delay, but now fervent Donkey Kong fanatics would immediately be invested in Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's quest. After all, they were introduced as Diddy Kong's allies, and they were even neighbors in the same island chain. While Rare definitely leaned into Diddy Kong Racing launching a shared universe in the last few months of his development, it's still unknown if they were entertaining this even before Diddy Kong's entry, and when Banjo and Conker were exactly added to the game. Diddy definitely gave the game a DK series makeover, with bananas even replacing the Rare branded coins on the track to increase your top speed. But there's debate over whether or not Banjo and Conker might have been earmarked for the title when it was still Pro-Am 64. As far as Crunch the Kremling, who, as the instruction manual put it, went to Timbers Island to make sure that there weren't any anti-Kremling plots in the works. He was originally known as Crash, based on the minecart riding critters in the first Donkey Kong Country. It had long been assumed that before he was Crash, he was just a generic alligator character who got retconned as a Kremling at the 11th hour. But that also might not be the case, and it's possible the character was added when Diddy was. It's important to remember Pro-Am 64 becoming Diddy Kong Racing didn't change the fact that this was a game that Rare was self-publishing and otherwise wholly owned. Nintendo, so desperate for a holiday smash hit, licensed them the name Diddy Kong Racing and the characters Diddy, Crunch, due to the fact that he was identified as a Kremling and thus Nintendo's natural property, and Banjo, an IP that Nintendo owned at the time. But everything else about Diddy Kong Racing, including other characters like Timber, Pipsy, Tip Top, TT, and Whizpig, that was all the property of Rare. A seemingly benign piece of trivia in 1997 at the height of Nintendo having a minority stake in Rare, but one that would get vastly more complicated in 5 years' time. Even if Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Quest hadn't begun life as part of a Rare shared universe, by the middle of 1998 there were arms of Rare that were definitely juggling those balls loud and proud. Banjo-Kazooie itself would feature a return showing of Diddy Kong Racer Tip Top, as well as an appearance by a Noddy, a beaver species from the Donkey Kong games. There was shared universe foreshadowing, with this autographed photo of Conker character Barry the Chipmunk seen in Rusty Bucket Bay, and references to Cranky Kong, Conker himself, and even Kong animal buddy Radley. Rare's website, Rareware, would also launch around that time and get flagrant with it in character write-ups, such as this biography of Conker.
He may look cute, but don't let that fool you into thinking that Conker's adventuring skills don't match up to his enthusiasm. Just like his good friend Diddy, Conker is easily bored by the quiet daily routine of his treetop village, and he'll seize any chance to go bounding off into the woods with catapult in hand. He's as swift and athletic as any squirrel you'd care to name, and a crack shot with his weapon of choice, making him a formidable challenger to anyone who dares cross him.
12 Tales Conker 64 itself would enter development hell, meaning the intended Game Boy and then Game Boy Color tie-in, Conker's Pocket Tales, would release first in 1999. While the Conker series would always go lighter on the shared universe connections than Banjo-Kazooie, especially once 12 Tales was reformulated as the mature-rated Conker's Bad Fur Day, Pocket Tales still subtly acknowledged its sense of place, as Conker had to fend off resident Donkey Kong Armadillo's armies at various points in his solo outing. And behind the scenes, Rare had even grander ambitions to pay off the promise of Diddy Kong Racing. The ending of Banjo-Kazooie introduced 3 mystery items that were either visible or alluded to throughout the game, explaining that they could be obtained once the game's sequel, Banjo-Tooie, was released. This was going to be implemented through a process called Stop and Swap. And look, now's not the time to get into the full, sordid, convoluted history of Stop and Swap. All you need to know right now is that Banjo-Kazooie actually contained 7 secret items, the Ice Key in Waz's Cave, and 6 question mark eggs. The architect of Stop and Swap, Paul Makachek, and others at Rare devised a plan to interconnect 6 Rare-developed Nintendo 64 titles, with the first game following Banjo-Kazooie to utilize it being November 1999's Donkey Kong 64. By relying on the Nintendo 64's internal memory, you'd be able to quickly go from Donkey Kong 64 to Banjo-Kazooie and back again, the aforementioned stopping and swapping, i.e. swapping out game cartridges, taking the Ice Key in Waz's Cave to Donkey Kong 64, where the Kongs would then use it for their own purposes. It's likely Donkey Kong 64 would have introduced its own mystery item, this golden Kong relic that'd be found on the podium in Creepy Castle's museum, which could then be taken into another Rare game. The only absolutely confirmed games that were earmarked for Stop and Swap are Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, and Banjo-Tooie, but it's likely the other 3 would have been 12 Tales, Perfect Dark, and Dinosaur Planet. Jet Force Gemini is excluded from suspicion because it released a month before Donkey Kong 64, with no stop and swap residue, and it was DK64 that alerted Nintendo to what Rare was up to, asking them to put a kibosh to the feature in a hasty fax in October of 1999.
It's like a chimp with a machine gun.
Alas, we would never get to see the characters of Rare trading their arcane artifacts, or thus be able to run with the notion of Perfect Dark somehow being part of the Donkey Kong universe. It's also likely the extent of Stop and Swap would have been scaled back, even if the feature had been allowed to carry forward. Nintendo would have probably gotten cold feet about making completionists feel like they need to seek out the M-rated Perfect Dark and eventually Conker. And of course, Dinosaur Planet never even made it out on the Nintendo 64. Oh, Dinosaur Planet. This is where the early sugar high of the immediate post-Diddy Kong Racing Donkey Kong universe meets the reality of the slightly more anarchic, less structured Donkey Kong universe we wound up with. Because Dinosaur Planet did start life as a full-fledged Diddy Kong Racing spin-off. Not an after-the-fact spin-off like Banjo-Kazooie and Conker, but a title that went all in on the notion. It was originally Dino Island, or Dinosaur Island, a game starring Timber that would seemingly play into similar notions of the caveman time travel RTS that Adventure Racers originated as. According to former Rare artist Kev Bayless, who worked on Donkey Kong Country, Diddy Kong Racing, and Dinosaur Planet, Dino Island originally starred Timber, who was going to be a time-traveling tiger with a rucksack, little fingerless gloves, a baseball cap, and a small dinosaur for a sidekick. Note that the public didn't learn of it being Dino Island until 2023, when Banjo-Kazooie artist Ed Bryan shared an old document from Rare from that era. And the small dinosaur for a sidekick? Diddy Kong Racing's Tricky, the boss of Dino Domain. The time travel aspect might even account for how he'd appear in the game as a child. For all we know, Dino Island was what Timber's Island was in the past. Or maybe the game was a prequel to Diddy Kong Racing that explained how dinosaurs came to live on a modern island full of woodland critter petrolheads. Now, the game Dino Island evolved into would still eventually explain that, but whoo boy, it'd be a bit of a walk to get there. The ambitions the team had for Dinosaur Island eventually outpaced the confines of what the Rare archipelago could provide it, both in setting and in tone, and it was decided to separate it further from Diddy Kong Racing by making it an entire Dinosaur Planet. Once again bumping the character of Timber from the starring role, but this time with a new character, Saber, an extraterrestrial humanoid canine. Saber would be joined by Crystal, at this point a feline, and the Angel Random, the Wizard Randorn, for a sci-fi fantasy adventure on the titular planet. Just like Stop and Swap, Dinosaur Planet is also too weighty a topic to concern ourselves with in full detail here, but all you need to know is that little kid Tricky survived the transition. Although the connections to Diddy Kong Racing were now obviously being downplayed, Rare never renamed Tricky, who is presented as a Triceratops in Diddy Kong Racing, but now retconned as an Earthwalker, a fictional tribe of dinosaurs consisting of Strachosauruses, Protoceratops, and yes, Triceratops. When Dinosaur Planet was announced for the N64, DKU fanatics celebrated, while we had no knowledge that the game once starred Timber, which would have probably caused a fandom riot had the truth been known at the time. The fact that Tricky would more or less be spinning off into his own series, and a grand cosmic fantasy prequel at that, was enough to buoy our optimism. After all, if a minor boss can get his own game, what was stopping Bumper the Badger? But then a funny thing happened. Just like the fateful meeting behind the scenes at E3 1997, another occurred 3 years later at E3 2000. Nintendo was purportedly impressed with what they had seen of Dinosaur Planet so far, and thought that merging it into the Star Fox IP could create a game with even more market appeal. And so, because history cruelly rhymes, this history of how the dinosaurs got to Timbers Island would also see a beloved Nintendo character taking over the starring role, this time in a game fully owned and published by Nintendo. Dinosaur Planet became Star Fox Adventures Dinosaur Planet, potentially the first in a new, ongoing Star Fox Adventure series by Rare, helping to reinvent the Star Fox legend, just as they had done for Donkey Kong in 1994. Now, several characters from Dinosaur Planet also survived this change, from General Scales to Crystal, who is now a humanoid fox like, well, fox, to make things extra sexy between them. And Tricky, this young tag-along dinosaur who got his start as a gruff boss in Diddy Kong Racing, who was intended to have his backstory explored in a Timber game, and then made it into Dinosaur Planet, was now a Star Fox character. Now, I hear all of the naysayers out there screaming at your monitors and devices right now. And you know what? You don't even need to leave that comment. Consider your point registered. Just because this character is named Tricky doesn't mean he's the same Tricky from off of Diddy Kong Racing. After all, Rare has reused names before. But I'd argue that the name Tricky
Nice name.
makes no earthly or Saurian sense in any other context than him being the very tricky, as in cheating bastard, dinosaur from Diddy Kong Racing. And it's indisputable that this was the developmental origins of the character, as confirmed by Lee Loveday in the Rare website letter column Scribes. Oh, hi Urkel. Even before we knew how far back the history went. Oh, hi Chad. Given that Star Fox Adventures came out at the very end of the Nintendo Rare partnership, and by that point had been shortened to lose the subtitle since there would be no further Star Fox Adventures after this, a time period where Rare would want to distance any grand shared universe connection between themselves and Nintendo. But this is something that they've slowly reconnected with during the last decade and a half, even more or less confirming that, yes, the dinosaurs in Dino Domain come from Dinosaur Planet.
Do I get my own spaceship?
Remind me to do a whole video on this at a later date. So does this mean that we consider the entire Star Fox series to be part of the Donkey Kong universe? Not exactly, although this is all a point of subjectivity, and your space mileage may differ. Just like how we accept that the events of the Donkey Kong arcade games happened, we also treat Star Fox 2, and/or Star Fox 64 as part of the backstory. Star Fox Adventures is established as taking place 7 years after the events of Andross's defeat, after all. But we consider Star Fox Adventures to be a Rare reinvention, an integration of the series into the DKU from that point on. That also means that the two direct follow-ups it received after Rare's purchase by Microsoft, Namco's Star Fox Assault and Star Fox Command, co-developed with Nintendo EAD by Q Games, are also considered DKU. After all, they both follow up on the events of Adventures, continue to feature characters once conceived for Dinosaur Planet, and even features a return trip to Dinosaur Planet, revealed in Assault as a nickname for the planet Sauria. Star Fox 64 3D and Star Fox Zero both reverted the series back to a pre-Star Fox Adventures timeline, so we consider those to be along the lines of that Donkey Kong Jr. keychain that was released in the late 1990s that inexplicably use the Smash Brothers artwork of the adult modern Donkey Kong in some regions? Yeah, they're like that. And yes, this means that by our logic, the entire Star Fox series is actually a prequel to Diddy Kong Racing, taking place a few decades before Donkey Kong's banana horde is first stolen. All because Timber the Tiger is cursed to never receive his own game. Many fans feared that Nintendo declining to purchase Rare in the early 2000s, leading to them being bought by Microsoft for their nascent Xbox platform in September 2002, would bring an end to the Donkey Kong universe. It was a shared universe literally being torn in half. It's still not clear how they decided to divide up the assets in the divorce, but they did devise the cleanest solution. All Donkey Kong and Star Fox intellectual property would stay with Nintendo, including the Diddy Kong Racing name, while Rare would walk away with Banjo-Kazooie and obviously the characters and games they already owned, including Conker and everything concerning Diddy Kong Racing except the name, Diddy himself, Crunch, and, sometimes Tricky? But I remember arguing on the DK Vine forum at the time that no, this wasn't the end of the Donkey Kong universe. Even if Donkey Kong could never reference Banjo and Kazooie again, and vice versa. No matter what the lawyers said, you could never truthfully disentangle these properties. Banjo and Conker would have always made their debuts in Diddy Kong Racing. They would always be in-universe friends of Diddy Kong. In a way, it's a situation not too dissimilar from the Muppets. The Muppets were, at one point, a fairly unified shared universe, with the core franchise, Sesame Street, and Fraggle Rock even coming together for A Muppet Family Christmas in 1987. But in 2000, the Sesame Street character rights were sold to Sesame Workshop, and in 2004, the core Muppets brand was siphoned by Disney. However, nobody denies that the Muppets still exist within the same shared world, even if crossovers are now far more uncommon and unlikely. And just before the buyout, Rare had inadvertently drafted the blueprint for how the shared universe could continue, at least on their side of things. Banjo-Tooie, the 2064 sequel to Banjo-Kazooie, is nearly as important a game to the structural foundations of the DKU concept as Diddy Kong Racing is. Not only did it follow up on the Banjo-Kazooie cast, and finally confirm that tip-top fucks, but it fleshed out or introduced characters who would keep the DKU alive for the next quarter century. Banjo's bad luck goldfish Royston was first given a name and dialogue in Banjo-Tooie, and from there he would go on to appear as Easter eggs in numerous Rare games, even disguising himself as a piñata in Viva Piñata. Mr. Pants, Rare's intentionally website mascot, would make his video game debut, as a proper character, in Tooie. And Captain Black-Eye, the scrapped pirate antagonist for Dream, whose portraits appeared in Banjo-Kazooie's Mad Monster Mansion, would finally show up in person in Jolly Roger's Lagoon, and then become a minor background presence throughout the DKU, up to and including Sea of Thieves. Allegedly, Greg Mayles even sailed as him as well. Oh, and then there's Saberman, the star of the 1984 Ultimate Play the Game classic for the ZX Spectrum, Saberwolf. Saberwolf was occasionally referenced throughout the Nintendo era of Rare as the name of the lycanthrope in Killer Instinct, and, well, Saber the Wolf from Dinosaur Planet. But Saberman, resurfacing in Banjo-Tooie, was Rare's first attempt at actually reviving the character in series. A game that was as instrumental to the success of the Stamper Brothers as Donkey Kong was to Miyamoto. Before Banjo-Tooie, Saberman really had no consistency of design, and chances are if you were either born after 1980 or simply weren't a resident of the UK during that decade, it's the Banjo-Tooie remodel of Saberman that you're familiar with. Rare clearly had plans for Saberman for the forthcoming Nintendo GameCube, codenamed Dolphin at the time, and even if a shared universe was never the initial plan, by the year 2000, they knew what they were doing. The fastest way to take a mascot character who had only been known to regional computing nerds, and briefly Japanese Famicom owners, some 15 years prior, a character filled with some not-so-subtle hints of British imperialism as his basis.
For the Empire, what?
Was to launder him as a supporting cast member in your worldwide popular 3D platforming series. Just as Diddy Kong Racing could make Banjo and Conker into household names before their games even launched, those same fanatics who played through Banjo-Tooie would already be primed and ready for Saberman's grand return on both the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo GameCube. Well, Saberman did eventually appear on the Game Boy Advance, in a criminally overlooked classic. But due to the buyout, that dream of riding on a dolphin never came true. He almost rode on a menagerie of wild animals in Saberman Stampede, an Xbox 360 game that Donkey Kong Racing evolved into. But that too was not meant to be. Still, Saberman getting smuggled into the DKU and redesigned to fit this shared world of Rare, just as Donkey Kong and, to a lesser extent, the Star Fox cast had, wouldn't it be the last time Rare franchises that either predate Donkey Kong Country or were contemporaries of it would get soft rebooted and fully acknowledged in the DKU with physical character connections? It would happen in 2016, when the 2013 reboot of Killer Instinct would add Rash the Battletoad as a playable fighter. The Battletoads were not part of the DKU, nor was the original Killer Instinct, but an accessory Rash could wear on his back that was actually Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts' Lord of Games got KI 2013 over the finish line. But in 2020, Battletoads itself would be soft rebooted in a new, more cartoony style, and that game featured an appearance by Captain Bones from off of Sea of Thieves. At this point, it's likely that every Rare franchise will eventually be lumped into the same shared universe, and they'll openly acknowledge and celebrate it as such. But considering this all really got started with Donkey Kong Country, that's still where DK Vine's main area of interest lies. And despite the legal separation between the Rare and Nintendo sides, the connection has never been forgotten. Rare's handheld team continued to develop titles for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS until 2008, cross-pollinating them with callbacks and call-forwards to other games in the DKU. For example, Espresso the Ostrich was left in 2005's Banjo Pilot, an artifact of when it was Diddy Kong Pilot, but an appearance nonetheless. Tip Top continued to appear or get alluded to in every Banjo-Kazooie game until Nuts and Bolts. But Nuts and Bolts did directly reference the events of Diddy Kong Racing, with it being name-dropped as Banjo's first appearance, and him recalling Taj and Whizpig. Conker also hadn't forgotten about his time in the hovercraft, having this to say in a promotional interview for 2005's Conker, Live and Reloaded.
Let's see then, might as well get it over with. A little bit of history first. As many of you may not know, because half of you probably weren't even born until the mid-1990s, plus it's something I don't really talk about these days, yours truly made his first appearance in Diddy Kong Racing on the N64 way back in 1997. Things were different back then, you know? I was different. It goes without saying you wouldn't catch me hanging out with any of those freaks these days. Last I heard, one of them was in jail anyway.
We later learned the imprisoned Diddy Kong racer was Bumper. Oh, so that's what would stop him from getting his own spin-off game. There's going to need to be an entire DKU Lore Tour video devoted to that subject, as the lurid details would kill my ability to monetize this one.
What's the kick? Why don't you do it at home like the rest of us with a big flat screen TV, 50 channels of pay-per-view?
But regardless of the improprieties of the DKU's inhabitants, Rare has never found it improper to reference the DKU. Even Sea of Thieves continues to make subtle allusions to Donkey Kong, weaving its own Byzantine pirate saga into the backstory of Donkey Kong Country, Banjo-Kazooie, and Viva Pinata. And then there's Playtonic Games, a splinter studio formed in 2014 after several Rare staffers left Manor Park. They'd quickly make their own name by trading on a very familiar name, launching the Kickstarter campaign for Yooka-Laylee, a 3D platformer that served as a spiritual successor to the Banjo-Kazooie franchise. Spiritual successors are, by definition, not part of the franchise or shared universe in which they're homaging. They're what happens when some of the original creative talent, or simply fans who admire and long for a new entry in a beloved property, set out to recapture the special alchemy of what made the original so cherished, without the rights to the intellectual properties that the lawyers are guarding like a dragon sleeping in a pile of gold. But the Yooka-Laylee franchise, and Playtonic as a whole, is a special deviation from the norm worth mentioning. Because some of those creatives at Playtonic couldn't help themselves. And yes, they were no doubt egged on by the likes of, well, us, and sneaked an unnamed goldfish into Yooka-Laylee. This is Dr. Puzz, by the way, an octopus who accidentally spliced herself with human DNA and needs a fishbowl to survive on land. She and said goldfish were designed by Ed Bryan, the artist who, on the Banjo-Kazooie team, was the one originally responsible for Royston the goldfish. Playtonic has obviously kept coy about whether or not this fish is supposed to be the same one from over at Rare, taking refuge in yet another video game franchise from his never-ending plight of being caught, cooked, and partially eaten by those who vowed to take care of him. But seeing as how there are also numerous other connections to the DKU across the Yooka-Laylee franchise, including the DK rappers, implied Zinger Hive infiltration, jetpacks, butlers,
excellent, jetpacks and butlers. Here we come.
Even Banjo and Kazooie themselves being just off-panel throughout the canonical Yooka-Laylee and the Cracklestone graphic novel. It's safe to say that, from Playtonic's quiet perspective, Shipwreck Creek is probably just a distant corner of the same archipelago where the Kongs, Bears, and other freaks, as Conker called them, reside. Not that this is an entirely valid viewpoint for everyone, mind you. Because the original creative pool has spread far and wide since 1994, when Rare worked with Nintendo to soft reboot the Donkey Kong series, followed by their purchase by Microsoft in 2002 and Playtonic's founding in 2014. It's not really fair to say that what Playtonic does with Yooka-Laylee dictates Nintendo's understandings of Donkey Kong or Rare's stewardship over Banjo-Kazooie. Because it doesn't. That's just patently absurd. From Rare's perspective, Playtonic's meddling with their IPs would probably be considered non-canon. Nothing more than elevated fan fiction with the endorsement of former employees. Likewise, I don't think Nintendo's ever going to have a trophy in a Smash Bros. Game for Glimmer the Anglerfish that explains that the Kongs named him after a famous constellation visible to pirates over the Sea of Thieves. That's why I adhere to something I call the Spheres of Canonicity, a simple logical field guide to understanding how canon is perceived by the studios. We at DK Vine follow the outermost sphere, which acknowledges Playtonic canon, which would then encompass every sphere within. Rare's sphere still affirms Donkey Kong and Dinosaur Planet's influence, along with the occasional nod to their characters' misadventures with the Mario cast. While Nintendo's sphere keeps things to just the intellectual properties they own, with some bleed-over recognition of the Banjo-Kazooie series, which is just too ingrained, popular, and historical to ignore, especially considering it was once a Nintendo IP. 3 companies, 3 interpretations of canon, but 1 shared universe.
Can we all 3 just parachute down from Cloud Cuckoo Land?
But the danger of going completely off the rails and losing sight of the core tenets of this shared universe, and the allure of what drew us in as fans in the first place, is why DK Vine follows stringent rules that, to some, may seem overly draconian or nonsensical. Mere Easter eggs or references, while something that can shore up shared universe bona fides after the fact, aren't enough alone to make a game part of the DKU. It can only be achieved through a physical character's appearance, a tangible acknowledgement that these characters exist together in the same reality from an organic starting point. If a DKU character's in-the-flesh appearance occurs in a franchise's first game, that franchise will then be considered natively DKU as a full-fledged spin-off. As an aside, this is the debate that television historians have when it comes to the purported Happy Days spin-off Out of the Blue. Sort of a reverse Diddy Kong Racing situation here, as the episode of Happy Days that was designed to introduce the audience to Random the Angel didn't air until over a week after Out of the Blue premiered. Sitcom's online owner Todd Fuller says, "Some people have identified Out of the Blue as a spin-off series of Happy Days. I disagree and maintain that it is a crossover series."
Out of the Blue premiered on September 9th, 1979, and the Happy Days episode, Chachi Sells His Soul, where Random the Angel appeared, aired on September 18th, 1979. This would make it a crossover episode, and not an actual spin-off, in my opinion.
Ugh, is that how I sound? But of course I agree.
Greatest legal mind I ever knew.
It failed to be a backdoor pilot when the series it was supposed to promote made it to air first. The inaugural appearance of a character eclipses everything else when dealing with these nebulous, shared universes that lack unified branding. But good news, Random fans! The first episode of Out of the Blue did have an appearance by Robin Williams Mork, meaning that it actually is still part of the Happy Days universe, just not as a spin-off of the main show. It would be what we at DK Vine put in our Fish and Chaps category, largely a dumping ground for rare series loosely spinning out of Banjo-Kazooie, or featuring a Banjo-Kazooie character or their off-screen voice in its debut game, like in Cameo, Elements of Power.
Our generation didn't know the damage microplastics were doing to us.
But even with physical character appearances in games, you still need something of a stamp of authenticity from the Donkey Kong series, Rare, or Playtonic to be more than just a temporary crossover. Those temporary crossovers are what we term Cameo games. Yes, this is where we address Super Mario's connections to the Donkey Kong universe. Cameo games would more accurately be called crossover games, but we labeled them Cameo games in 1999 because we were being extra petulant towards Mario. Just a few more seconds. Cameo games are when a natively DKU character appears in a game that's not part of the Donkey Kong Country lineage, or developed or co-developed by Rare or Playtonic with the intent of being set in their shared universe. While this could range from Rare characters comprising a team in #IDARB to Donkey Kong showing up as a boxer in 2009's Punch-Out!, it's most commonly associated with what Donkey Kong himself has been most commonly associated with, at least if you're a normie, for the last quarter century: Mario games. Specifically, multiplayer Mario racing, sports, and party games. Mario Kart 64 was the first time the modern Donkey Kong appeared in a non-Rare game, effectively replacing the Donkey Kong Jr. version of the character from Super Mario Kart. Although actually Wario replaced Donkey Kong Jr. and Kamek replaced Koopa Troopa, with the Donkey Kong Country DK then replacing Kamek. In case that ever comes up in bar trivia. This is where our rigid diagnosis and rationale for what embodies canon in a shared universe falls back into the principles of sitcom television. For a great example, we only have to look at the 2025 crossover between Abbott Elementary and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where the characters of the two shows cross paths when the Sunny Gang had to do community service at Abbott. First he meets Frankenstein, now this? Taking this episode at face value, then It's Always Sunny and Abbott Elementary definitely take place within the same fictional world. But that doesn't make Abbott Elementary a native It's Always Sunny spinoff, as Frasier was to Cheers or Better Call Saul was to Breaking Bad. Nor does it mean that either show is required to respect the rules and logic of a shared universe. It's Always Sunny is a show that was born in 2005 and had 16 full seasons before the gang ever crossed paths with the faculty at Abbott, while Abbott Elementary existed completely independent of It's Always Sunny for 3.5 seasons. Yes, this specific episode of Abbott Elementary is absolutely canon to It's Always Sunny, just as the episode of It's Always Sunny at the end of its 17th season that incorporates the Abbott Elementary characters is canon to the latter. Afterwards, both programs will go their separate ways, with later episodes not necessarily adhering to either show. Think of it as two streams or rivers temporarily converging, but rather than forming a confluence, they once again split off. Or two separate trees having their vines entangled, sharing the primates within, but still retaining their own individual roots. This goes both ways, such as when other franchises cross over into the DKU, like Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean and the former LucasArts Secret of Monkey Island into Sea of Thieves, or Yacht Club Games' Shovel Knight into Yooka-Laylee. This is why DK Vine instituted something called the Waluigi rule. The Waluigi rule basically states that nothing within a defined Cameo game can therein natively be DKU, including characters who debut in said game. An open question in the early days of our community and website, when such a thing was still a hypothetical, but then became a rapidly growing concern when the character of Waluigi made his debut in 2000's Mario Tennis. Because the Donkey Kong Country version of Donkey Kong was also featured in the game, there would inevitably come a day when Waluigi made an appearance, but DK didn't. And we'd have to ask, hold up, is Waluigi a DKU character? Is every game that Waluigi appears in part of the DKU? And no, he and Donkey Kong of course exist in the same physical space or world, but following the character of Wario's sort of brother, as we would Donkey, Banjo, or Conker, obviously felt wrong. antithetical to where our interests lied, and contrary to the spirit of why we became fans in the first place. A line had to be drawn to prevent the DKU concept from being watered down, because at a certain point, it could encompass the entire multiverse of video games, which by 2018 wasn't even out of the realm of possibility. This isn't to say we don't respect the shared history between Donkey Kong and Mario. They obviously got their start in the same arcade game. They cross over all the time, and even share billing in a long-running series, and thus will always be two sides of the same coin. Yeah, it's easy to see why someone would think of Donkey, Diddy, or even Funky Kong as Mario characters first and foremost. But from the perspective of the universe Rare built on top of the Donkey Kong Country games, we view them more as sister series, with both Super Mario and Donkey Kong Country being the two outgrowths of the original Donkey Kong arcade trilogy. The former the focus of Shigeru Miyamoto and what was then EAD, the latter what Rare would use as the basis for their unintentional shared universe. It's that break in the lineage, beginning with Donkey Kong Country, where we focus our coverage and our fandom. But Super Mario and the modern Donkey Kong absolutely coexist as sister series. It's a bit like the relationship between Superman and Batman, or Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. Like Donkey Kong does to Mario, Donald still dips his duck bill all filthy in Mickey's rancid business. But then there's a whole rich Disney Duck universe with its own characters, spin-offs, and lore. And to draw from the television well one more time, it's like how The X-Files had a sister show called Millennium. Unlike the Lone Gunman series, Millennium was not a spin-off of The X-Files. They existed independently from one another, and big world-altering events in one would never be acknowledged in the other. But they did have the occasional crossover, and years after its cancellation, Millennium is still mostly associated as part of the X-Files brand. The same goes for the sitcom Wings, which was created by former Cheers writers, the same ones who would later spin off Frasier, and while also not a spin-off, would often have appearances by the popular Cheers characters. A similar scenario also led to the creation and later crossover of The Critic with The Simpsons, although Futurama would more accurately be described as The Simpsons' true sister series. Two streams that occasionally converge and then go their separate ways, but will always share sentiment or sediment with each other. But even after laying all of this out, I know there are still going to be those of you who disagree. And that's fine.
I am not crazy!
The DKU is just a framework of fandom. And we're not arguing that you have to see things exactly how we do. If you think the shared Rare universe should encompass every single Ultimate Play the Game and Rare title, there are very valid reasons for you to start with Jetpack or the original Saberwolf. If, from your perspective, the Donkey Kong arcade games are the only logical starting point, and therefore it's the Super Mario universe, and Banjo and Conker maybe should be included, but Grabbed by the Ghoulies is one goldfish too far, and are we seriously hitting with this Dinosaur Planet shit? Then congratulations, you're also correct. Even DK Vine's staff disagree on some of these points. For example, when to define a Cameo game rather than a full-fledged spin-off. Yooka-Laylee character and dick joke Trouser appeared in the 2023 indie 3D platformer Clive and Wrench, which we currently have listed as a Cameo game because it was developed outside of the purview of Playtonic or Playtonic Friends. But it's also the first entry of a series, so it'd otherwise be considered a spin-off. But then we'd have to consider other games featuring Yooka-Laylee cameos, such as Mighty Fight Federation or Jitsu Squad as natively DKU. And then we run into the same problems the Waluigi rules logic is supposed to subvert. But even if we can't fully agree on where to draw the line, I argue that this is the kind of minutia that's fun to debate as fans. The truth is, this isn't the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's no arbiter like Kevin Feige dictating things from on high. At one point that was just Rare, back when they still controlled the direction of the Donkey Kong series and Star Fox Adventures, alongside Banjo-Kazooie and Conker. We even made the hypothetical Pepito Kong argument before the buyout, which posited what we would do if Rare ever made a game starring a speculative Kong we dubbed Pepito, that had no other connections to Donkey Kong or appearances in the greater DKU. That would count, because Rare was specifically making a game with the shared universe in mind. But after the buyout, and the splintering of the DKU, Pepito Kong became nothing more than a shattered dream. Although not so shattered that I couldn't claim my monkey in Sea of Thieves as him, however. Does this make me the Kevin Feige of the DKU? I could have word of God, as I have a prestigious spot in the Sea of Thieves credits. Yeah, I'm kind of a big deal. You can find me right next to Heeb the Cat. Meow. Amusingly, Feige's projects in the MCU actually adhered to our strict DKU character appearance philosophy up until 2021's Eternals, which had no pre-existing roles or guest appearances for past Marvel Studios characters. Ugh, maybe our way is best, but does that make Sony Pictures' Morbius the MCU's equivalent of a Cameo game? Or Deadpool and Wolverine their version of a laundered reboot, like Killer Instinct 2013?
I've got so much microplastic in my balls.
But without the unified branding and legal endorsement that the Marvel Cinematic Universe enjoys, it really is up to each of us to figure out our preferred interpretation of how we consume this entertainment. We have ours, and it's been going for over 30 years strong. And even though the future of Donkey Kong continues to evolve and adapt well beyond the era of Rare, the franchise's enduring future is secure. And every now and again, we find ourselves rewarded when even the most surprising source acknowledges the truths we hold to be self-evident. And even the lawyers agree to play nice. It's all one big happy universe. A Donkey Kong universe, if you'll allow it. Will you allow it, lawyers?